And with us here in the studio is, of course, the former chairperson of the Independent Electoral Commission, Dr. Brigalia Bam. Good evening, Mama. Thanks very much for joining us. Now, I'm looking at the court papers that have been filed by these political parties, and I just want us to go through some of the issues that they are raising and just get your opinion on them. Now, one of the first issue they're raising is that in various instances they say people voted multiple times, although they admit that the extent of this they do not know. Your thoughts?
As far as I could hear from the media, I think there has been an investigation on this. And I take it that the procedures have been followed, which are laid in the law, on how you handle that kind of thing. If somebody has done that, then somebody obviously has seen them, and they've launched a complaint. And I'm sure there must have been political parties who were at the voting station when this happened, because you do need somebody who is a witness, who actually has seen it, because at times you run a big risk of stories and false information. And if you haven't actually seen somebody who is willing to say at such and such a station, these people were stopped, or I saw them being served, and I reported them either to the police at that time or reported them to the political parties. That's more or less, that's the first stage of the process, and I'm sure it was followed. And then the next group, which is a very important group, which we have set up in this country, and it's unique. Actually, we are the only ones who set it up. This goes to all political parties to listen to the complaint, because the political parties are also part of a group that has to find the solution. It's the responsibility of people who are not following the rules or they are not honorable in any way. It's not the responsibility of the Electoral Commission. It is also the responsibility of political parties. That is why we created in this country what we call the PLC, the Party Liaison Group. That's a second group that goes to it. And then from there it moves on then to, finally it lends itself to the Electoral Court. That is why our Electoral Court in this country is in operation. It has been in operation all these last few days. So I am not sure whether then they have followed all those procedures. What I seem to get a feeling, but I'm relying on the media, is that sometimes people were not sure of the rules and the legislation and the processes of what happens when these things occur. Because you either have to check that the ink has been washed. After they wash the ink, well, you will not see them when they wash the ink, obviously, whatever other reasons people have for washing the ink. And then did they go then to the next station? Where did they go? Somebody must have followed them through to watch their performance. And they should be following through, carrying the forms. If you are going to vote in this country, there is a law. If you are going to vote in another voting station for one reason or another, you have to fill a form with all the particulars, and you must submit that form. You have to submit that form. So there is a record somewhere of these people, and that record must be found.
Well, interesting that, I mean, the police are now saying that these people were caught attempting to commit the acts.
In this case now of attempting, how were they walking towards a second? Was somebody following them? Was it one person? Was it 20 people? I hear the number 20. Was somebody following them from station to station? Was somebody aware that they're up to something and became suspicious and followed them? How did they know that they were going round? Who saw them?
In this case, do you think that is perhaps a situation where you find the smaller political parties wanting to perhaps get media attention by calling on almost foul play when it comes to the electoral process in itself, that the smaller political parties may not necessarily be happy with the outcomes of their progress in elections, and therefore saying perhaps the process and the electoral process was not up to scratch. Therefore, certain issues around counting are being questioned, issues around the credibility of the votes are being questioned. Do you think it's that? And I'm just playing devil's advocate really at this moment when it comes to these political parties.
It's difficult because many of these parties, too many of them, I understand, have not been with the Electoral Commission for a long time. And it also could be that beside that, people are not aware of the procedures and all the various steps that are put in place so that people can begin to do that. I am not sure. And in any case, if something happens at a voting station and there is a fraud, that doesn't mean that you have to stop the whole country from voting.
That means that you root out the bad apples so that you can continue with the process.
Yes, that is the law.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that if somebody says they have seen somebody put ballot papers in their chests and hiding the ballot papers, that doesn't mean that you stop the whole country from operating. And that doesn't mean that because of that particular action by a particular group of people or by a particular party, then you have got to stop the whole process. And you say the whole process is not credible. I think that's what people do not understand, that you will always have, in any country, you will always have something to go wrong. I have been to many countries in the world. I've been in our own country when we started. There is always something that is bound to go wrong. If a voting station is not opened, or 10 voting stations are not opened, that doesn't stop the elections to go on in the whole of South Africa. It doesn't mean that because these 10 voting stations were not opened, the elections necessarily will not be credible. You see, that is why we have a court.
From what the former president of Nigeria, Goodluck Jonathan, was saying during his observations in terms of the electoral process, particularly in South Africa, and he was making reference to how the process is in Kenya, for example, and saying, listen, you have to appreciate the professionalism and the manner in which these elections were carried out. Noted, and the fact that, however, he did make a note about how we need to start, especially within the next 10 years, modernizing and going digital for the sake of making the voting process easier and more secure. Because I'm sure you can appreciate, Dr. Bam, that when you've got about over 30 of the political parties crying foul with these elections, it's not a good look. It's not a credibility look. But even though the president is saying we need to look at this digitization perspective so that we can at least align, not just for the South African context, looking at the continent in itself.
You are aware that, of course, where the countries have tried to do that, there is a crisis of security. United States is a case in point. Is that the security now that is being experienced in other countries who have gone 100% on digital, that it is not because there has been hacking in other countries where there has been people who fidget even with the systems. So it is not always, our problems here are not really necessarily related to the fact that we are manual. We are manual for all kinds of reasons, why we have remained manual. And the reason we have not been able to move fast, by the way, it's important to say that when people say digitization, I remind them all the time that we were the first ones in the world to establish this system. So we started quite early in South Africa, though we came very late into the practice of elections. But we were in fact very privileged and lucky that already there was so much technology. Our scanning, we were the first ones to do the scanning. So what people are all seem to forget when you talk of digitization, they are talking only about the actual electronic voting. But a number of our systems, in fact, it's the electronic voting that people are saying, once you go into electronic voting, then everything is resolved. It's not true.
Speaking of which, Dr. Bam, I'm glad you mentioned the scanners, because one of the complaints from these court papers is that many VDs did not have scanners, or scanners did not work. Now, as someone who is familiar with the architecture that has been built over the past 25 years, where are the safeguards? Where are the safeguards in this process, and how critical are the scanners in that architecture?
The scanners are very, very critical. But in fact, those people who are aware of what happens in other countries is that you put the scanners, but you also have to have provision to go manual. Because we have had experience, even in this country, in the early days when we started with the scanners, that something would go wrong because we are somewhere at the end of the world and the systems are not operating for one reason or another, because we never know with technology, as it happened in this very place, that we had a crisis here in the beginning, that we had to get and phone technicians all over the world, because with technology, of which I am not really part of, something is bound to go wrong. And even with those provisions, we have a lot of them, because after every, here in South Africa, every time we have elections, we have an evaluation, a very intense evaluation. Not only do we look at the things that went wrong, we look at the areas of improvement, and technology is one of them. And these scanners have gone through all kinds of changes. We started to use them in 1998, and we have been changing them and improving them and putting this to them to modernize them. And that's something that we are also trying to do as Electoral Commission. I told though I'm here, but I more or less know what goes on. You have to keep changing with it. And actually, I wish I could sound modest, but I'm not going to be modest, because I have had an opportunity to be all over on this, and I'm still serving in one of the groups that is working around the world on the best systems of elections. We are still leading, in spite of all these complaints that we have, on a number of things as South Africa. We are still very much ahead, even on, amazing enough, even on technology. Because the biggest problems in elections have to do with the counting. That's where the crisis lies. Yes, things can go wrong at a voting station, but the most critical period is the final phase, and the final phase of counting. That's the phase that is most critical. And if you look around the world and you look anywhere, it's always where the conflicts are not in the campaigning, they are not in the voting process, they are always in the counting process. And that is the most important one. And that one we keep refining.
Now, before we let you go, Mama, now everyone is pinning their hopes now on what's going on, the audit that
yes.
the IEC has to conduct. And I don't know if you heard from the interview that Aldrin Sampear
yes.
did earlier, where these parties are calling for an international firm to be involved in the audit process. But my question to you is, normally, or under normal circumstances, how would the IEC conduct the audit? Who presides over it? Who gets involved? And what gets into that whole process?
I'm afraid probably because we don't have that experience. We have our own, in South Africa, as you know, we've started our own audit, which is done by our own firms in South Africa. And they have a final word on our own South African audit, which is one of the processes we have. And for that kind of thing, that it will probably, the decision will have to be made through the court of law. Why we need that kind of audit. I don't think it's something that somebody can say, we are not happy with the results. There has to be something of substance, because that entails the process and procedures of getting an international group to come into South Africa, expenses, and what is it that they are going to audit after the elections. We keep all the boxes according to law. That's why we're using paper still in South Africa, because we're only 20 years. That's why we still need that piece of paper. And so it will be interesting to see what kind of company will come to do that. I'm sure they are free to do that, but I would imagine that decision will have to come through the electoral court and probably go through the constitutional court. It's too serious an accusation for a nation to be audited internationally.
Dr. Bam, we're going to leave our conversation there, but thanks a lot for joining us this evening, shedding some light in terms of where to from here for the political parties that have expressed their grievances, where to from here in terms of the electoral procedure as well, and your views regarding that. As I said, observer missions have been in the country and have been observing the electoral process, and some are saying free and fair, and of course the political parties wanting to approach the electoral court. But thanks a lot for your time this evening.
Thank you very much. Okay, I hope they will, I hope it will be all sorted out.
I hope so too.
Yeah, it's not